To close this ceremony, we would like to give the floor to Alfonso Gómez Méndez, former Attorney General of Colombia and former Procurador of Colombia. Welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, like Mr. Jorge Enrique Botero says, for coming, for being here, despite that the coffee rounds and other things that are out there look attractive. I, of course, would like to begin by greeting former Minister of State and Executive President of Fasecolda, Mr. Jorge Enrique Botero, who I naturally thank for his invitation, as well as Fasecolda, Vice President Sandra Solórzano, all the members of Fasecolda board, insurers who are here today, Honorable Politician Didier Burgos, former Minister of Finance Alberto Carrasquilla, and all those who in general are with us here tonight. When Mr. Jorge Humberto Botero invited me, I was surprised much more than former Minister Carrasquilla, because as you were able to see, he knows about insurance. I said, what am I going to talk about there? I could have come as a spectator to learn, and at a certain point I thought, I'm going to feel there like a rooster in a chicken coop, like we used to say at Tolima, where there were hens and chickens and chicken coops. But when he told me that it was an academic meeting to reflect about the situation of the country, I felt less fearful, because I believe that at meetings like these, when they have this academic nature, and when you, as is my case now, have no public responsibilities, well, you can let go or let your tongue loose without fear of punishment. For this reason, then, I have called these reflections the peace process and its effect or its incidence on the political, social, and economic development of our nation. I will begin by saying that despite what is usually said when one talks about we are going to solve the conflict of the last 52 years, referring to the appearance of FARC precisely in my place of origin, Tolima, well, we're not precisely saying the truth in several directions, as I'm going to mention shortly. But firstly, because indeed in situations of conflict and war, we come from much farther what I had to live as a child, the period of the liberal and conservative violence. But I go even further than that. Almost always have we lived in a situation of war or armed conflict. Curiously, and because that's something I'm going to mention later on, the only period where we were relatively peaceful was starting in 1910, after the 5 years of General Reyes and the assembly that year, and the 1940s, maybe earlier. And this coincides with the period where the Constitution was left alone. because, as we will see shortly, generally, wars amongst us, and especially in the 19th century, occurred because of a change in the Constitution, because of modifications of a Constitution, as we're going to see shortly. And the scheme, the model has been more or less the same. War, amnesty, pardons, and then new wars, new conflicts, to return to new pardons, to new amnesties, in a chain that seems to have no end. I would like to dedicate a couple of minutes to delimit what is understood as armed conflict, because we sometimes use concepts about which validity or about which scopes we do not dwell deep into. In fact, here, the concept was established of civil war, and especially abroad. When one says that Colombia is putting an end to a civil war, the foreigners might think that we are divided, one part of the population supporting FARC and another part not supporting FARC, and that is not true. Perhaps the only stage very similar to, other than those in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, the only part similar to this was the liberal conservative violence, where one talked about undeclared civil war, because yes, the population was divided between or into those who sponsored violence on the liberal side and those who sponsored violence on the conservative side. But what one understands as armed conflict here in Colombia? Or, it's stated in other terms, what is the nature, what has been the nature of said armed conflict? The majority of conflicts in the world have certain more or less known causes. Religion, well, we still see killings because of religious motives. Not us. We, perhaps Jorge Enrique Botero, who's also a historian, the War of the Supremes in the 1940s. But in general, religion has not been a cause why we kill each other. Land division, independently of whether land ownership has had something to do with the conflict, never, hear me well, never was at stake the Colombia's territorial integrity. Nobody here thought that there would be half of Colombia a capitalist and half of Colombia a socialist. Race. Yes, in many countries you still see killings because of racial issues. Here, there's probably, I would say, a racism sort of in a larva stage, which results in still, people here talk about La Negra Piedad or Black Piedad, but nobody talks about White Noemí or White Maria Emma. Even in delinquencies or in criminals, they talked about the Negro Acacio or Black Acacio, but not the White or Blanco Marulanda. But that has not meant that we kill each other because of this. Not for that cause, no. Initially, one could think that here there was an ideological cause, especially in the beginnings of the FARC guerrilla in 1964, and later ELN with their attack to Simacota in 1965, were to a certain extent influenced by the Cuban Revolution. Their intent was to take over power via weapons, to impose a communist regime. But this apparent ideological cause began diluting over time, especially at the time when FARC made two political mistakes. One, to make kidnapping a political weapon, which, by the way, was not started by FARC but by the M19 group. Second, when FARC became involved in drug trafficking, something that, by the way, for a long time made difficult the negotiation, because it is very easy to negotiate with a poor guerrilla group, but very difficult to negotiate with a wealthy guerrilla group, as we are still seeing. I was saying that at that time, the political direction or north point of the guerrilla group was lost, because one would have never imagined Marx, Engels, or Lenin with a pack of cocaine on their shoulder. In fact, some years ago, Cambio 16 magazine, which doesn't exist any longer, conducted a study analyzing the proposals of the guerrilla at that time of the paramilitary, and to a certain extent what we can call the establishment. And there was an identity in 95%. With this to say that not even the ideology justified today the existence of a conflict which it truly began degrading without knowing why and what for. In fact, if one looks at the agreements of Havana, it's explainable that they're doubtful, Mr. Humberto, because where you're from, that the Greco-Caldense generation who wrote a lot and talked a lot. And of course, an agreement between Timochenko and Humberto de la Calle, both from the coffee growing region, had to be very long. So, not even if you analyze those extensive and agreements from Havana, there's nothing that could not be signed by a democrat in Colombia. Social justice. In fact, I think it would have been done by Francis I. First, social justice, true democracy, rural development, and agrarian reform. In fact, the agreements in terms of land territory are much more conservative than what used to be President López Pumarejo's reform in 1936. One first reflection then, because it's not a classical armed conflict, the ways out of classical armed conflict solutions were not applicable, including foreign intervention, which happens or is done where there's indeed failed states. I would complement this with the following observation. The existence of this armed conflict in theory has not hindered either political development or the formal operation of a democratic state. What does this mean? When there's wars, there's no state. Here, despite or in spite of, we have had elections, we have had a Congress with limitations, but we are not in the first day of creation. We are not in the first day of creation. The Colombia was able to develop. I really liked the presentations by the young and brilliant director of the planning department, as well as Mr. Carrasquillas, and Jorge Humberto, they show how the country has been running despite this.
Ahora bien,
Now then,
lo que podemos llamar
what we can call the armed conflict,
que yo lo llamaría
that I would
más exactamente,
call more
el manejo del orden
accurately
público
the management of public order
y otros
as to
factores
an armed conflict and other factors having an influence in the public order. The management of public order has resulted in that us, despite of everything we say, even law professors in class, we have not had a rule of law that operates formally. We have not had a rule of law that operates thoroughly. We have had like a carcass or a protective cover with many like sort of daggers that really hurt us. But because of this management of public order, well, this that in other countries is called the rule of law, as Americans call it, well, it's been there in suspension points. Let's look at this very quickly. How has this public management have an influence? And that's why I've always said that the existence of the armed conflict, as I presented it, is not the main problem the country has, but it is and has been the main pretext for us to see our reality and occupy ourselves or take charge of the true problems of our nation that I will very quickly mention shortly. What was the 19th century? The civil wars. There was no rule of law, no formal rule of law there, because some would rise for a constitution, others for a reform. What happened in the early 20th century with the Thousand-Day Wars, which is the same to this, recruiting of minors, barbaric acts. The Battle of Palo Negro, where today is the Bucaramanga airport, there were 1,000 dead people, mostly with machetes and clubs. And how was it solved? With an amnesty agreement and a pardon agreement. With, in this short period I mentioned, there's other data or other significant dates in the 20th century. 1949, this period of violence had started after the assassination of Gaitán. Ospina Pérez's administration, November 9, a state of siege decree is issued to close Congress with the argument that operation of Congress was incompatible with management of the public order, and we had 10 years without a Congress. The legislation was entirely state of siege legislation, customs regime, everything was done then and afterwards. Now, in theory, we had a constitution, in theory, but in practice, everything was done. Secretaries were appointed through state of siege decrees. There's a statement by Morales Gómez, a minister during Rojas Pinilla's administration, a minister of finance who had a secretary where there were no computers, called Doña Elvia, and he said, Doña Elvia, take out your pencil that we're going to legislate. And that's the way the country was ran. 1953, a coup by Rojas Pinilla. Argument for the coup, ending the violence. That Saturday, June 13 of 1953, the statement by Rojas, no more blood, no more predators by any party, and he said he was going to govern in the name of Bolivar and of Christ, not present Christ, present time Cristo, but Christ or Cristo
con el argumento del orden público.
of past times with the argument of public order. A coup.
1957 con el
1957
argumento del orden público.
with
¿En
the
qué
argument
sentido?
of public
Para
order.
poner fin a la violencia,
In what
a la
sense?
violencia
To
liberal
put an end to
conservadora,
violence,
para
to the
que no
liberal
se mataran
conservative
más
violence, to
liberales y
stop the killing
conservadores.
between liberals and
Entonces,
conservatives.
nos inventamos el
So
plebiscito
we
que no
invented a
existía.
plebiscite that did not exist. This figure of plebiscite did not exist in Colombia's juridical order. And what do we establish with this? The National Front, Frente Nacional, which was to put in suspense and was ended in 1959 with the alternation, but it was put on hold. In the 1990s, once again, another cause of public order generated by narco-terrorism. We had to resort to figures like faceless prosecutors, with faceless witnesses, and for what? To resolve the public order. In 1991, when as an expression of that Colombian trend of believing that we change everything by changing the Constitution, and we had this avalanche of changing the Constitution of the 86, which, by the way, in 1990 wasn't the Constitution of 86 because it had undergone many changes. But people were made to believe that all our evils were in the Constitution of 86. You could almost apply this anecdote by Torres, who said that during a protest, everybody was upset and somebody said, "Muérase nadie," or nobody died, and those who followed him understood death to Sanabria, or muera Sanabria, and they started looking for Sanabria to kill him. This happened in 86, and we're seeing it now that we need to change the Constitution. In fact, I remember an expression by the president of Aso Huevo at the time, who said egg prices should be recorded in the Constitution.
What was done in 1991 for public order, but public order not as is usually considered, that it was for the peace process with M19. The peace process with M19 was done by President Virgilio Vargo before the Constitution, with a decree of a state of siege. It was done just to leave aside the violence of narco-terrorism. And here we have two paradoxes. One is that what's enforced still of the Constitution of 1996 was the one used to change the Constitution, with the argument that the cause of the disturbances in public order was the national Constitution, and they used the decree that was issued in April 1984 with the assassination of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. And it's a cruel historical paradox, and that is that drug traffickers, they just produce quite a bloodshed in this country because they were going to be extradited. And for that reason, they killed so many people: Rodrigo Larga, Guillermo Cano, Luis Carlos Galán, policemen, soldiers. They killed lots of people and they put bombs everywhere, and that despair led to the amendment of the Constitution, and it is that amendment what removed the extradition to drug traffickers. And as recently said, if drug traffickers would have thought that in the administration of Gaviria, of Galán, would have had what they had in the administration of Gaviria, who wanted to set negotiation, not extradition, imprisonment to Pablo Escobar, most likely Galán would have been today a former president of the Republic. So that's another stage And just because of public order, there was like a suspension in the rule of law. So the Constitution was amended for a mechanism that had not been anticipated. And in order not to bore you with this topic, now we have the Havana Agreement to put an end to the conflict with FARC. And that has always happened, and we have to swallow many frogs. I don't know if we're going to be chopped by them, and we have also suspended the rule of law in many things, and I'm only going to mention one. Having to accept that a government or a Congress proposition is equal to a national referendum, also with the decision of the Constitutional Court, which is something that I still do not understand too, in spite of the fact that there was an apparatus, a state, having to establish a parallel mechanism as the GEP in order to solve the problems stemming from the conflict, with the argument that ordinary justice was not capable of doing so. What has happened that most of the people appointed, they come from ordinary justice or regular justice. So they are bad in ordinary justice and they're good for the GEP. That was a second idea. And I was saying not that the existence of the conflict has not been the main problem, but it has been an excuse not to act in the fields in which one must act. This happened in this nation while the former British colonies, for example, the U.S., they devoted to create a nation, to create the conditions of economic development. We devoted to draft constitutions during the 19th century and even in the 20th century. Just one data, the Constitution of 1986 had 79 reforms in 100 years. The current constitution, that of 1991, in only 26 years, I mean, it's youth. It has been amended or infringed more than 42 times. There is a relationship between economic and social development and constitutional stability. If one looks at the U.S. With the Constitution of Philadelphia, they've done everything. I mean, they've done some amendments, but actually very few. Germans, after the Second World War, with the Constitution of 1949, they have amended it just a few times. The French with the holistic constitution. While we have dedicated to amend the Constitution, and hence the real problems are not faced, and we are left amending the Constitution very quickly. Which are, among others, the real problems. Let's start with citizen security. Citizen security is affected whenever there is an armed conflict. However, the figures indicate something else. For example, the figures of the National Police indicate that only 5% of delinquency is related to the armed conflict. 95%. I mean, what really affects citizens, what affects life theft, they have nothing to do. And what we have lacked here when it comes to that topic is to have a responsible criminal policy and a stable one in which you have the intervention of Congress, judicial power, and public force. Regarding what Mr. Botero said a few minutes ago, he said that the figures of forensic medicine are not that accurate. Well, most likely they are indicated the insurance companies have better data. It's not that they eat more, it's just that the figures are well fed. So that data of forensic medicine indicate how, with respect to the armed conflict, obviously I'm not going to read all this, I'm just going to read 2 or 3 years. 2005, homicides, let's call them common homicides, 17,000. Homicides are related to armed conflict, 2,221. And that is still like that, and the figure is even higher regarding the reference between armed conflict and homicides because of traffic accidents. They do not include injuries, personal injuries. There are more homicides today in this year, 2017, because of car accidents. Most of them are motorcycle accidents than because of the armed conflict. And let's add to this, why do we have so many homicides other than these that I mentioned? Because of many reasons that we have wanted to ignore. The disintegration of the family group. I mean, if you talk to a doctor, you'll see that 12% of Colombians have mental diseases. The statistics have not shown which of those have public responsibilities, public or political responsibilities, but 12% have mental illness. There is a lack of power to solve that. See what happened in Cajica. A lady had a small traffic issue, and the man reacted, going over the lady. So have we considered, or have we thought about the type of society we have, the type of education we're giving, what's the type of family we have today, which are the values that we are conveying? That's much more difficult than amending a constitution. Secondly, of those problems of the nation that we need, what is it that we need? We need a strong institutionality. We need a strong state. When I say a strong state, I'm not speaking of a repressive state. I'm just talking about a state that works. And we need a real legality and not a formal legality. What do we need? In this same direction of a state that works properly, a state where we will have a division of powers. The division of powers here is formal, it's not real. We need for the Congress to be independent from the executive power, and the judicial power will be independent of the executive and legislative power, and independent of its passions, some of them very low, as we have recently seen. But what do we have today, mainly after the so-called Frente Nacional or National Front? I've read a couple of days ago that when they were presenting the GP, and they said the presentation is going to be addressed by senators and the name and the government. That doesn't happen in the U.S. In the U.S., the members of the parliament do not get their addresses drafted. In the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Citizens in Article 16, it sets forth that a society in which the fundamental rights and the division of powers are not guaranteed, it lacks a constitution. So we do not have a division of powers, because here, contrary to what's considered, It's not that the debate should be on privatization, because the first thing we privatize is the state through clientelism. And that system is the source of corruption. When a member of the parliament is given a region, an entity, so they can manage it their way, obviously, we know that that good things cannot stem from that. Existentialism, we have a political system in which the president is the main actor of public life. Everything goes through presidentialism. This is the only country in which former presidents are still called presidents. In the U.S., that happens only when they die. That's when they are part of history, and the role of former president should be another one, just as is the case of Mexico. They have a 6-year period, and they leave to go and take care of their grandchildren or just to take care of their birds, but they cannot tell others how to manage the country, how to do things that they didn't do. That presidentialism is so strong that, for example, the president influences on the magistrates that are chosen. The territorial topic in Colombia, the territorial division in Colombia, the decentralization, the Constitution wanted to emphasize decentralization, but because of presidentialism, the governors have to be in the queue in the National Planning Department, in the Ministry of Finance, and there is no real independence of the territorial power. And, well, what has happened during these 26 years with the governors and mayors? No one can just turn back the popular election of mayors, but we've seen that that X number of governors and mayors do not complete their term, and not because of ADCs, but just because they have to go to jail, and they have to just start with puzzles, and the country has to think about this. When it comes to a strong institutionality, it is indeed very important to have political parties. And I want to take 5 minutes to talk about that, because that's key in a democracy, to have political parties, but real political parties. In other words, organizations with ideas, with different programs on the management of society and the state. And here we have another paradox. While there was no judicial regulation, we did have parties until before the Constitution of 1991. I mean, you had the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, but not only that. People forget that we had the MR, ANAPO, and the Communist Party, and the Constitution of 1991. I think it's going to get to a point where we'll need to have a judgment on the political power, and this includes the so-called tutela, which is praised, but other things cannot be praised. The Constitution of 1991 to put an end to this bipartisan system. Can you imagine where in the world do you have the party of the U or the Z? I mean, what have we seen in these 26 years? political parties that exist for one day. The U Party, it has the name because of President Uribe, who founded this party. But I recently said a professor of political sciences in any university in Colombia that will give them an exam and say, okay, just indicate 4 differences between the Liberal Party, Cambio Radical, Partido Conservador y la U. They're going to flunk because there's no difference among these parties. So we have now these new parties, and they're all acronyms. I'm talking about respectful men. There was a man who was elected by an indigenous party. But you look at this guy and he doesn't look Indian. And another respectful man that is part of public life, Mr. Sergio Fajardo. He was elected, and you're going to listen to him on Friday. He was elected by the Indigenous Social Alliance. And after the election, I went to Medellin, and I thought that I was going to have a group of indigenous there, because all of a sudden, Medellin was taken over by indigenous. But no, it was an acronym. Today, we have the Green Party with very representative figures of our political life. But tell me, what does this Green Party has to do with the ecological parties of Europe? You know who is part of the Green Party, or who was part of the Green Party in 2010 who confronted President Santos, Sergio Fajardo, Lucho Garzón, Enrique Peñalosa, Marta Lucía Ramírez.
Entonces, y por eso es que la gente cambia de camiseta.
That's why the people, they change their T-shirts. It's okay for football players to change their T-shirts, but they just change their T-shirts very easily. Hay un término flip-flop. I remember that there were some councilmen from a political party that was in Spain, and they had gone to PSOE. So they used to call them tráfugas, and they could not go to the movies or anything because they were called tráfugas, so they decided to wear wigs. And I was saying, if we applied that in Colombia, can you imagine? And it would be the best thing for the economy, because, I mean, the wigs demand will increase significantly. Another core topic, I mean, related to armed conflict and political parties, what we have seen here, I mean, this needs to be serious. Let's be serious about it. And one of the ways that we can be serious about it is through the principle of political responsibility. It's, I mean, you should respond not only in criminal aspects, but in political aspects, because of inefficiencies, because of a lack of results. Perhaps the best example could be the one in those Mexican songs. I mean, you are a very good bartender, but the clients leave the bar. So if they do not have results, I mean, you could be a great person, a good father, a good boyfriend, but you have to leave. But that's not the case here. No one is responsible for anything. I mean, who responded for when Pablo Escobar fled the jail? From jail. No one responded for that. President Gaviria criticize the administration of President Santos, but they stay in the government. I mean, when that used to happen, there was like a ministerial crisis. So I think that we cannot be a strong and institutional state without separation of powers, without political responsibility. Now, the justice-related topic. Well, this topic it has many angles, but they're basically one. We have done what should not be done. What have we done that should not be done? And that is that we think that to change or to improve justice, we have to amend the Constitution. In 1945, no, in 1910 there was an amendment because of justice. In 1945, Alberto Lleras amended the Constitution because of justice reform, and then the plebiscite. And in 1968, there was an amendment for justice reasons. In 1979, for justice reasons. In 1991, the two things that resulted from the Constitution amendment have been the source of corruption. Once having or given that power to the magistrates to appoint others. So what happened? The political bug was part of justice. And so actually no one investigates anyone, but the justice topic is different. That is what happens at the level of high courts. That should be done without changing or amending the Constitution. Why are we going to amend the Constitution to ask a magistrate not to ask for money? I mean, you only have to apply the criminal code. There is a rule that I inspire as a general prosecutor, that it's of illegal wealth. You have to compare income and expenses. I mean, if a mayor comes to the mayor's office and he goes to the mayor's office horseback riding, and after 2 months he has a Mercedes-Benz. So it is as simple as that. And for that, you do not have to amend the rule. For that, you do not need to amend the Constitution. And for that, you do not have to impose those regulations for magistrates, to be honest. Actually, there are many things that one can do when it comes to political reform. We have had so many political reforms. The main political reform, what will be to close the kitchen in the palace for the members of the parliament not to go there to negotiate their presentations. In the case of magistrates, to require many things before they take office. They should show their passport to indicate that they have traveled. So this way they don't have to travel around the world instead of working when they're supposed to work. I mean, they're supposed to make decisions, and they should show that they study, so they will not have to attend courses for magistrates, and they have, really put an end to all their passions, so they will not now take the path of passions. So this strong state is built without having to amend the Constitution and without having to put in place so many regulations. For example, when it comes to ill-gotten money, I mean, all those who have had public responsibilities in this country, we have many people here that have never really worked in their profession, or they never married a rich widow. And you see that overnight, they become wealthy. I mean, they go from poor to millionaires. How come that is not explained? And that is sufficient to fight corruption? Well, with public corruption and private corruption, because obviously there is no public corruption if there is no private corruption.
es, ahora sí, nos hemos tenido una democracia, es verdad, pero es una democracia.
Yeah, we have had a democracy, but it's purely based on elections. We haven't had a real democracy, among other things, because as I state, I mean, we really brag about being freed from Spaniards, in addition to the economic part, that now we have lots of Spaniards here. But why? Because we have a monarchy here. We inherit everything when it comes to politics. I mean, there are people who are born and they already have they become presidents, candidates to the presidency. They have that in their diapers. So we have an inclusive society. But how can we have an inclusive society? Only through education. Education should be the only channel of social attention that was mentioned this afternoon, but it's not enough to have that curve that higher education increased. It is what type of higher education, public quality education, so that as in the U.S., everybody will start the same. That's why I admire the U.S., because there is a division of power, there is a strong middle class, and I think that 30% is still very little, Mr. Humberto, because among other things, the middle class is the one that sustains the democratic system. I mean, who's going to sell a vote in the U.S., in France, or in Germany? And that education, where when you're born, everybody has the same opportunities. That is what an inclusive society means. Otherwise, we're going to continue repeating this model. And to conclude, I would like to say that what we need is to create this nation, to have that sense of belonging. And in order to have that sense of belonging, we have to revalidate the sense of history, not to forget our history. I'm surprised about the ignorance about history of our young people and those that are not that young. We are lacking leaders that will give us some guidelines. I mean, we could have many politicians, but we are lacking leaders, so that we will not continue using the excuse of the armed conflict. That's why I really celebrate that the armed conflict has come, to an end, because now this will be uncovered, and we will start acting now, and not, as President Lopez said, that we have to do the resolutions by means of an agreement. Thank you very much.